Welcome to the second module, Recognizing Depression and Suicidal Ideation in Students. Ron Miller, who has been a school psychologist with Cincinnati Public Schools since 1988, in addition to providing psychological services to our schools, he is also the clinical director for Cincinnati Public Schools Critical Incidents of Stress Management since 2004. And has trained over 400 mental health professionals on this approach. In addition, Ron has authored articles in professional journals focusing on functional threat assessment and critical incident of stress management. It is my privilege to introduce Ron Miller, who will address the serious topic of depression and suicidal ideation in our students.
I'm Ron Miller. I'm a school psychologist, and I'm also the clinical director of Cincinnati Public Schools' Critical Incident Stress Management Team. This presentation is a part of the Safety and Violence Prevention curriculum from the State of Ohio Department of Education. I will be presenting information to identify depression in students and take appropriate steps to prevent student suicide. Recognizing students who are depressed or suicidal doesn't initially seem to be something that many of us will encounter. But we know that many students have emotional struggles, and they don't just leave those struggles at home when they come to school. Depression is a common struggle for many students, and perhaps the most severe consequence of that depression is suicide. For those of us who have never been depressed, it can be difficult to imagine a pain so intense that the only reasonable course of action is to take one's own life. But that's the reality for millions of people who suffer from depression. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death for teenagers, and it's the fourth leading cause of death for children under the age of 14. Knowing that emotional problems can have such a big impact on students, most of our schools in Cincinnati Public have now partnered with a mental health agency who can provide mental health services at school to students during the school day. Because students spend so much time at school, we know that teachers can play a key role in preventing student suicide. Although no one expects teachers to be mental health therapists or provide therapy to their students, we know that teachers can recognize the signs, reach out, and then refer students to appropriate resources. That is, they can recognize the signs of depression and suicide. They can reach out to students by telling them that you care, and then refer them to appropriate mental health services either in your school or in your community. Now, the objectives for my presentation are twofold. First of all, for you to familiarize yourself with the warning signs, risk factors, and protective factors related to student suicide. And secondly, to have the knowledge and skills to make appropriate referrals for these students. I'd like to spend some time talking about depression, because we know that many students who are depressed will think about suicide. In fact, about 50% of students who are depressed will start thinking about suicide at some point. There's two key terms I want to define. First is suicidal ideation. That refers to individuals who are thinking about suicide. Ideation refers to ideas, in this case, ideas about suicide, or someone who's considering suicide. The second term is suicide attempt, and that's someone who actually tries to kill themselves. So suicide ideation is someone who's thinking about suicide. Suicide attempt is someone who actually makes an attempt, tries to end their own life. Every 2 years, the federal government puts out a survey for teenagers, and they call this the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The most recent year for which this data are published is 2011. And in 2011, there were 27% of teenagers in the state of Ohio who said they experienced depression in the last year. 14% of teenagers in Ohio said they considered suicide, and 9% of teenagers in Ohio said they attempted suicide. That's 1 out of every 11 teenagers in the state of Ohio said they tried to kill themselves within the last 12 months. Those numbers are astounding. Now, we know that teachers are good observers of students' behavior. We also know that students who are feeling depressed don't necessarily wear these feelings on their sleeve. If they're feeling depressed, if they're thinking about suicide, they don't just tell the world. But children will demonstrate their emotions through their behavior. We can identify signs that a student is depressed through watching for changes in their behavior, changes in their appearance, and changes in their performance. Now, these things don't necessarily tell us exactly what's going on in a child's life, but they tell us that something's going on. So they're often signs that a child's depressed, but not all children who are depressed will show these behaviors. And not all children who show these behaviors are necessarily depressed. Many children who are depressed will show changes in their behavior. And those changes could include things like mood changes, including irritability or anger. Now, we often think about depression as being sad, and a lot of students do demonstrate sadness, but children often demonstrate depression through other emotions, like being irritable with others or being easily angered. They may also have mood swings. Other signs of depression for children include making negative statements about themselves or showing signs of low self-esteem. They may catastrophize, saying that nothing is going well, nothing will ever go well. They may also stop enjoying activities that they previously enjoyed. Now, this could include extracurricular activities like sporting events, participating in art or music. They could also include participating in things that the child does well and has been successful at. Children may also show depression by withdrawing from friends and family members. When they withdraw from these people who've been able to give them support, then it makes it even harder for them to recover from their depression. Children can also show depression through changes in their eating and sleeping habits. Changes in eating could include overeating or undereating, skipping meals. Changes in sleeping habits could include children who start staying up late or can't sleep at night, and so they are tired during the day. When kids can't sleep at night, it causes all sorts of problems. We need to be able to sleep, to be able to resolve the issues of our day, to be able to come back and think and concentrate and do all the things the next day that we hope to do with our days. And kids who aren't sleeping are having problems with all of that. And they may even be keeping up other family members. Some children may show changes in their sleeping habits by sleeping all the time, sleeping at night and sleeping during the daytime as well. Other changes could include psychosomatic complaints, kids who complain about not feeling well even though there's no physical reason. All the school nurses I know have lots of students who come to see them because they have stomach aches or headaches, and often these are pains that don't have a real physical cause, but it's caused by the emotions a child feels on the inside. Often they feel depressed. Sometimes we call the kids who have chronic complaints about stomach aches the belly achers. And there may not be a physical cause, but they're feeling emotional pain on the inside, and that's causing their stomach aches or headaches or other pains. Children may also start abusing substances. Now, that could include alcohol abuse, marijuana, other drugs, even prescription medications. And for kids who are trying to relieve the emotional pain that they feel on the inside with these substances, we often call that self-medication. But we can see that sometimes in remarkably young kids. Kids may also show increased risk-taking behaviors. Now, that could include things like running into the street or other behaviors that are so risky that the child could be hurt or even killed by doing it. Students may show depression through changes in their appearance. Those changes could include weight gain or weight loss, and it could also include changes in their personal hygiene. They may stop taking care of themselves, they may not come to school clean, they may stop bathing. And in those cases now we could be talking about behavior that starts affecting their friendships and their socialization, and that can have additional complications. Children may also show depression through changes in their school performance. That could include difficulty concentrating for students who didn't previously have those kinds of difficulties. It could include increased frustration with tasks that they were previously able to do pretty well. A lot of times that shows itself through its schoolwork. It could also include frustration with other students, even increased frustration with their teachers. They may show depression through increased tardiness or absenteeism. And they may also demonstrate it through their schoolwork. Now that could include, for kids who are depressed, artwork or creative writing assignments. That's where depression often shows up. Kids will start making artwork that has very dark or even death-like themes. And they may say things in their creative writing assignments or poetry that also reflects these depressive feelings. Some kids will copy down song lyrics of very, very depressing songs, and that's how we know that something's going on. Students may also show increased discipline problems. And so a kid who hasn't had a lot of discipline problems but all of a sudden starts getting into a lot of trouble at school, there's probably something going on with that student. Teenagers show all these same signs of depression. But teenagers also show some additional signs that they're depressed. They may show a persistent sadness and hopelessness. In fact, for individuals who show a combination of hopelessness and helplessness, we want to be very aware of them, pay attention to them, because we know that that hopeless and helpless combination could be a sign that this is a person who's starting to get to the point where they may start thinking about suicide. Teenagers may show increased irritability, agitation, volatile mood swings, even rage. And so they may show some of those same emotions that we've talked about with the other children, but in a more intense fashion. They may also show intense anxiety. Now that could include worries and worrying all the time, but it also could include things such as panic attacks. Teenagers may also show a higher level of indecision or forgetfulness. Now, we talked about kids having difficulty concentrating when they're depressed, and that's often because depression makes us feel like we have other things on our mind. We have other emotions that are taking over our thoughts. We have things that we're worried about and concerned about. And all of these things that someone who's depressed is thinking about makes it harder for them to remember the things they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So all of a sudden, teenagers may start becoming forgetful about things that they didn't previously have trouble remembering. They may also have difficulty making even simple decisions like, what should I have for lunch or what should I wear today? Now, the signs that we've been talking about are signs that students may be depressed. And these are signs that this is a student who needs to have some type of support. And we want them to have a chance to talk to someone who can give them support probably within the next day or so. But now I'm going to talk about some other signs. These are warning signs that students are suicidal. And in this case, these warning signs cannot wait a day. These students need to talk to someone immediately. No matter what time of day it is, they need to have someone that they can talk to who can assess whether they are in fact really at risk of suicide and to what degree they're at risk for suicide. So when we talk about these warning signs, we're often talking about students who make suicidal threats. They may write suicide notes, or they may say something that is a threat. Now, these threats can be direct threats like, I'm going to kill myself, or I'm going to be dead. They can also be indirect comments like, I won't be a bother to you much longer, or you won't have to worry about me anymore. In either case, these are very serious warning signs that we need to pay attention to immediately. Students may also start making final arrangements. That could include making arrangements for their funeral, giving away prized possessions or important belongings. It could also include saying their final goodbyes. Right now, it's popular for students to say their final goodbyes on Facebook. And so they may have an entry that says, this will be my last entry. I love you all. This is my final goodbye. That's another warning sign that we want to pay immediate attention to. Any sign that a student is making a plan for suicide, thinking about methods of suicide, or trying to gain access to the means to commit suicide is a very serious warning sign. And so we want them to have immediate attention when that occurs. Some students will try to hurt themselves, and that's something we also want to pay immediate attention to. Self-harm behaviors come and go in terms of popularity. Right now, the popular behavior is cutting. Students may cut their arms, their legs, their stomachs, or even other body parts. And in many cases, students are hurting themselves on the outside because of the emotional pain they feel on the inside. They feel very bad inside, and so they want some type of physical sensation on the outside that can help take away that pain or distract them. Now, these are students who are depressed, and those are very serious concerns. But some of these students who harm themselves are also suicidal. They're thinking about ending their life. The students who are only depressed need support, but often that support is outpatient mental health therapy. But the students who are also thinking about killing themselves, they need an immediate evaluation for their suicidal risk. So in either case, we want to give immediate attention to the students who are harming themselves. It's important to remember that children may get to the point of considering suicide differently than adults. There may be a catalyst or trigger for their behavior, and often that's something like an intense emotional event, such as being ostracized by friends or being betrayed by friends, or the end of a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. Any significant loss or even emotional worry can be a catalyst that can make a student start thinking about suicide. From the research, we know that there are many factors that can increase the likelihood of suicide for children. Bullying. Now, it's very popular right now that whenever a student makes a suicide attempt, that the students and teachers around them say, he tried to kill himself because he was bullied. But often, that's not the case. Not all students who are bullied tried to kill themselves. In fact, bullies are just as likely to attempt suicide as the kids who are being bullied. So whether they are bullies or being bullied, they do have a higher risk of suicide, but not all of these kids are going to make a suicide attempt. Another trait that can increase the likelihood of suicide is students who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered, or questioning their sexual orientation. These students often have difficulty navigating the social situation that they're in, and that could include peer relationships, relationships at school, as well as family relationships and relationships at home. They often lack an effective support system, and they can feel very isolated and alone. And they do have higher rates of making suicide attempts. Other factors that can increase the rate of suicide attempts for students include long-term physical illness, or students who are afraid of having a long-term physical illness. It includes students with a history of abuse, as well as students who have significant family stress. Now, that family stress can be a change in the family, such as a family that's been separated by divorce, or change in the family constellation, a family who's lost a family member to death, or even incarceration. It could also include family stresses such as changes that include a new addition to the family, a new baby, or even a family that moves to a new location. Another risk factor can include impulsivity. Some kids act based on their mood and how they feel at the moment. So if they could feel good one part of the day, but if they start feeling bad, they may do something that's so dangerous that it could hurt them or even kill them. Now, we also know from the research that there are many factors that decrease the likelihood of suicide for students. We call these resiliency factors. Resilience has been a popular topic in the research literature for about the last 25 years. And what we know about children is that children become more resilient when they have more resources. Resources can help children bounce back from difficult times and experiencing difficult emotions. Now, I've included a picture of my cat. My cat's name is Willow, and Willow is a very resilient creature. He was found when he was a kitten on the side of the road after his mother had been killed, and he was able to bounce back really well from that. I've got a picture here of Willow coming out of his box, kind of bouncing out of this box that he has made as his home. And children can also have a lot of resilience characteristics. Some of those resilience characteristics include responsibility to family, and that could include responsibility to their family members, as well as even pets, Who will take care of your pet when you're gone? Who will be there for your brother, your sister, your mother, or father if you die? Another trait for resilience is students who have strong religious or cultural connections. Students with strong religious beliefs often have a belief in a system that's larger than themselves, that can help make sense of difficulties that present themselves in our world. Students with a strong cultural connection have an understanding that they are part of a bigger culture, a system of people that's existed for a long time. And that can also help them bounce back from stressful situations. Some of the factors that help kids be resilient include resources they have on the inside, and that could include a general satisfaction with their life. It also includes the ability to be connected with the here and now, talk about reality and the factors that they face, and be truthful about what's going on in their lives. That could include socially, at school, and the family. That truthfulness helps kids put the pieces back together. Some kids have ability to discuss their emotions and behavior that also helps them resolve many of the difficult emotional issues. Students who have coping and problem-solving skills can also often figure out a way to bounce back from difficulties. Coping skills can help kids deal with stress and difficult situations as they're going through them. Problem-solving skills can help them figure out things and figure out solutions to problems. Any skill or talent that a student has can help them be resilient. Now, this could include extracurricular activities or things that they do well and things that they enjoy. These can remind them that they still have resources to offer others and that they have more to live for than just the current struggle they're experiencing. There's also resources that are external to students that can help them be resilient. Now, that could include social support, friends who can be supportive for them, as well as any family members who are supportive as well. I'd like for us to look at a video, and this video is entitled The Jordan Burnham Story. This was published by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the federal government. And as we watch this story of Jordan Burnham, I want you to look for a couple of factors. First of all, I want you to watch for the warning signs that Jordan was getting ready to make a suicide attempt. Now, for Jordan, he was hiding many of these behaviors that might actually serve as those warning signs. Secondly, I want you to watch for the resources that helped Jordan bounce back and recover to the point that he is now able to share his story with others. So two things, the warning signs and the resources that helped him bounce back.
When I was 16, I was a sophomore in high school. That was the year that I was diagnosed with depression, which was a little strange to me.
We look back on Jordan being diagnosed with depression, we would have never thought that. And especially with me being in high school and working with high school students, I feel he was going through the regular adolescent thing, starting to sleep in a little bit more, starting not to do all his homework, wanting to stay up late at night. Go JB, go JB.
I was a popular student. I was one that was always smiling, always laughing. If you saw me in a hallway, you would think that's the last person in the world to have depression. So it was confusing to me to be diagnosed and have those emotions when it seemed as though I had everything that I wanted. A girlfriend, playing sports, popular, but still it felt like there was still a hole inside of me and I couldn't figure out why I had a lack of motivation to get out of bed, why I was randomly crying. So when I was 16, I was going to school with a mask on my face, acting and pretending as though I was really happy with the things that were going on around me.
When Jordan was first diagnosed, we really didn't realize what was wrong. And I think from my perspective that I sort of understood that with depression, it sort of gave answers to some things where I think it took time for Earl to really understand that these were the things that were going on and why he was behaving in the way that he was. And for Jordan, I think it was hard at first. He didn't, like in therapy, didn't talk a lot at first to the counselor. Then he began become a little bit better with it, with talking to her. But when I look back on it now, I don't know really at that point that he really even accepted the fact that he was depressed.
So the way I handled it was that I saw the therapist twice a week. I wasn't very talkative. I was probably 80% honest. The one thing that I definitely wasn't honest about was drinking, as well as taking my medicine. Even though my therapist reminded me 1,000 times that whatever is said in this room stays in this room, I figured I definitely shouldn't tell her that I was drinking and coping with things in a negative way. And when it came to my medicine, I made a mistake that a lot of young adults and teenagers make, is that they take the medicine for a couple weeks, even maybe a month, and they start to feel great. And they figured, well, I'm cured, I'm good to go, and they don't deal with it again, and they stop taking their medicine. With my suicide attempt, there were so many things that were built up and were the foundation of these thoughts of not wanting to be here, to not wanting to be on this earth, wanting to try and take my own life. And I think one of the biggest things was the pressure of being a junior and senior in high school. Is you start to realize that this is when you have to start taking life seriously. Because I wasn't taking my depression very seriously, so when I only had a C in a class, that's when I started to break down. That's when I started to shut down, and I felt like a failure. And the failure was one of the main reasons why I wanted to try and take my own life, because I figure if I'm not successful, if I'm not as good as my parents think I should be, if I disappoint my parents or make them upset, what is the point on being on this earth? There were also social issues. I'm an African American in a predominantly white school. I felt a lot of pressure when I'm the only black student in my classroom, and I felt like there was pressure on me to always have A's, to always try and fit in, when at the end of the day, it didn't matter if I was class president, if I was on the sports teams, if I was popular, I still felt like I really didn't fit in. And the other thing was getting caught drinking by my parents. When I got caught drinking, I felt like the failure of the family, simply because no one in my immediate family drinks. And so because of that, I felt like the black sheep. I felt like the scapegoat. When I had these suicidal thoughts, I didn't know how to talk to anyone, because I figured I was the only one who had those thoughts and emotions. And if I told someone, I just figured that the automatic reaction would be I have to go to a psych ward. Now, I did go to a mental hospital during my junior year after I had a breakdown, and I put pills on my desk and I threatened to take them. The funny thing is that when I was in that mental hospital, there were things that I told complete strangers because I knew that they understood where I was coming from. And I couldn't say that to my therapist. I couldn't say that to my parents. I couldn't say that to friends, because they didn't truly understand the real Jordan that hated himself, wondered every day whether I should be here or not. The day of my suicide attempt, I woke up just like any other day. And even though at that point I did have depressed feelings, I had depressed thoughts, there were days that I could wake up and forget about them, and that was definitely one of those mornings. And that's when my dad walked in with a duffel bag full of alcohol that I had in the trunk of my car. Now, when he dropped that bag, my heart dropped with it, saying to myself, I disappointed my parents yet again, as their son, someone that should be making them happy, making them proud. All I do is upset them. So what's the point on being here? My dad confronted me about the alcohol. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, but it didn't matter because everything was just numb to me at this point. And although my parents were very honest in that conversation, were very nice in that conversation, that was when I went into my room, like I usually do, whenever I'm upset or had a conversation with my parents. This time was a little different though. When she knocked the first time, I said, "No, Mom." And then she knocked again, but by that time I was actually out of my 9th-story window. It was impulsive. I didn't plan it that day. I didn't know that it would happen. That night I was flown to the hospital and given 48 hours to live, and then a 40% chance to live after that. And after being in a coma for 5 days, I started to come to. After, my suicide attempt, I still wanted to see a therapist. I still wanted to see a psychiatrist because I still wanted to take medicine and make sure that emotionally and mentally that I was still stable. Even though I knew I wasn't going to beat depression, I knew that I could cope with depression in a better way. Now, one change I did make was having a psychiatrist who did both the therapy and talking part and also administered the medicine. And I think that's something that really helped me out. I think that's something I really benefited from. I knew that 9 stories, it was a miracle that I was alive. So I appreciated being alive. I didn't fall into a bigger miss of depression. I didn't fall into a bigger miss of suicidal thoughts. I just felt as though I felt fortunate to be here. I knew that I had a second chance at life. Now, what I was going to do with that second chance, I had no idea. But I knew that I was going to make it a positive one. I would be lying to you if I said that I was laying in that hospital bed and I couldn't move, I couldn't talk, and I always had a positive attitude. But one thing I always thought was that I have to be at peace with the things that I can't control at this point. And that's something that I really held on to in my time in the hospital, is that I don't know when I'll be able to get out of a hospital bed. I don't know if I ever will. If I'll ever get into a wheelchair, if I'll ever be able to get out of a wheelchair, if I'll ever walk again. But I just wanted to be content with how my life was and try to help other people so that it didn't get to that point for someone else. Because I never want anyone else to go through the 5 months and the grueling pain and frustration that I did after my suicide attempt. So that was probably my main motivation to get healthy and to take my depression more seriously, is to not only make myself better emotionally and mentally, but also get myself to that point so that I can help other people out as well. With my depression, it's very important to have a healthy emotional balance, and the best way to find that is to know yourself, to realize who you are as a person and what really makes you happy. And that includes, for me, going out with friends, watching movies with my girlfriend, being able to hang out with my parents, to be able to be around people. I'm a people person, so I love being around people. Working out is huge. I love being able to work out, to physically still get better. Even though I'm able to walk, I still have a long way to go to physically be where I want to. It's very therapeutic to be able to tell my story, knowing that it's helping someone else and knowing that I'm making a difference and adding a positive light to society, which is something I never thought I would do before.
Really drew even closer, if that could be possible. But I think a big part of this was Jordan really, again, accepting that he did have a mental health problem.
I have the same depression that I had before, but the way that I cope and deal with it is in a much positive way than I did before. I don't have thoughts of wanting to try and take my own life. Do I question, how am I going to get through this day? Why am I here? Yeah, I definitely have thoughts of that. But what I do with those thoughts is different, and I think that's what's the main difference, is the coping abilities that I have now and the honesty that I have in being able to verbalize my thoughts and emotions with my depression. We're all going through different problems in some way, and it's not necessarily the situation or your event that got you down, that made you upset, but it's how you perceive it and it's how you handle it. The main message is that you're not the only one going through these problems and ideas and these situations, but you can verbalize them and you can cope with them in a healthy way to get you through that. And that's basically what I want kids to understand. That's something that I didn't know. I didn't know that there were other people going through the same type of issues, the same type of problems, that there would ever be anyone else that would have suicidal thoughts. I wish I did speak up about my emotions, about my feelings, because I could have heard someone else say, well, I go through those struggles as well. I could have heard someone else saying, I have stress, I have anxiety, I had those thoughts at one point. So in a way, I wish I would have verbalized that.
Okay, so now when we were looking for the signs that Jordan was getting ready to make his suicide attempt, we didn't really see a lot of signs that Jordan was making a threat or showing any of those very serious warning signs that we talked about earlier. But he did show plenty of signs of depression. He was diagnosed with depression his sophomore year, and that was because he started sleeping more, he started not doing his homework, he wanted to stay up at night, and he started having these crying spells. And so his parents then got him appropriate mental health therapy. But even at that point, he wasn't being honest with his therapist. He wasn't sharing the information that he stopped using his medication. He wasn't sharing the information that he was drinking pretty heavily. And so then he also had signs of perfectionism. He felt bad if he got a C. He said he was a junior in high school and he should be taking his life seriously. He also felt like a disappointment. And he was very much afraid of disappointing his parents. He said, what is the point of being on this earth if I disappoint my parents? He felt a very severe sense of disappointing his parents when they discovered the alcohol and that he had been drinking. And so that was kind of a trigger for him. Jordan was also a minority at his school. He was African American in a predominantly white school. And so he didn't really feel like he fit in. Now, after his suicide attempt, though, he had a lot of resources that helped him recover. Jordan decided to choose another therapist, a therapist that helped him manage his medication and could prescribe the medication as well as performing the talk therapy, the counseling. And I think probably for Jordan, that gave him a sense of control. He could share with the therapist what the medication was doing for him, and then he could have some input in terms of whether to change the medication or what to do with that. He was also being willing then at this point to talk about his alcoholism. Now, Jordan also made changes in terms of his personal relationships. He started being more honest with others. Now, previously, he said that he tried to choose the right activities, choose the right friends, and have the right girlfriend. But you might notice that he changed his girlfriend, and he said he started spending more time with his girlfriend, more time with his parents, building deeper relationships. His mother even said that she noticed that they had a deeper, stronger relationship after his suicide attempt. Jordan was also willing to listen to the stories of others, and he started becoming more willing to share his story. He was sharing things that was more meaningful, making more meaningful connections with others. And so knowing that he was able to share his story and provide something that was going to be able to help others was also significantly meaningful for him. Dr. Thomas Joyner developed a model of suicide that has 3 factors, and he said that when these 3 factors come together is when someone dies from suicide. The first factor is something he calls perceived burdensomeness, and that's someone who feels like they're a burden to others and often feeling like they're a burden to themselves. The second factor is something he calls thwarted belongingness. All of us need to have relationships. All of us need to connect to others. And these individuals feel a lack of that connection. Even though they may have tried to build relationships, they're not getting the connections or the relationships that give them a true sense of belonging. The third factor he describes as an acquired capacity for suicide, and that refers to individuals who spend a lot of time thinking about suicide, planning a suicide, even individuals who make multiple suicide attempts. Now, when we think about Jordan, he had a couple of characteristics that relate to Dr. Joyner's model. He had a strong sense of disappointment when he failed his parents. He felt like that was a very important thing to do, and he felt a strong burdensomeness, especially when they found out that he was drinking. He also had a sense of burdensomeness just when he had a grade that didn't measure up to his own standards. He lacked belongingness. He was a minority in his school, and so he didn't necessarily feel like he fit in. He wasn't necessarily building the relationships that gave him a sense of belongingness, but these were very surface relationships. He also was hiding some of his behaviors from other people, and that prevented him from making those stronger connections. In this case, he was hiding his drinking. Then he was not really able to be honest with others, including his therapist. So even though he had mental health therapy, he wasn't being honest. So that wasn't really helping him establish that sense of relationship or belongingness. Schools have the opportunity to affect those first 2 characteristics. We can help students recognize that whatever their failings, whatever mistakes they've made, whatever they've done, they're not really a burden, but they're a child that's growing and is maturing and going to be an adult one day. So we can help them change their perspective from a sense of disappointing others and being a burden to a sense of who they truly are, a child who will grow and who will learn. We can also give students a place to belong. Schools provide an opportunity for students to build relationships with other students as well as staff members. And so we can help facilitate those relationships and help students be in a place where they can build strong relationships. Cincinnati Public Schools has developed guidelines for responding to students who make suicidal threats or make suicide attempts. And these guidelines involve 4 steps. The first step is to make sure the situation is stable, stabilize the situation. Secondly, have the level of risk assessed. Third, provide appropriate protective action. And then fourth, provide appropriate follow-up. I'd like to go through these steps one at a time in more detail. First of all, if we recognize any of those warning signs that a student is suicidal, under no circumstances is a student exhibiting those traits to be left alone. We need them to be supervised at all times until we can determine that they are handed off to a responsible resource or until we can determine that they're not suicidal. I encourage teachers that if they see any of those warning signs to speak to the student immediately. Now, I encourage you to talk to students privately, so you can talk to the student in the hallway or wait for a transition. Wait for a change in classes and then talk to the student. Now, it's important to talk to the student just to find out what's going on, if they're thinking about suicide and to what degree. Now, even if the student denies thinking about suicide, if they've shown one of those suicidal warning signs, I encourage you to go ahead and have that student taken to a staff member who can perform a risk assessment. And that's our step 2. And at that point, reassure the student that there is help that is available to him or her. Now, the second step is to have the level of risk assessed. So the student needs to be escorted to someone who can perform a suicide risk assessment. Now, teachers can call for security or someone else to come to their classroom and escort the student to that person, like me, who can do that risk assessment. But I encourage teachers to call someone to your classroom to watch the classroom, and then you escort the student down to me. That sends a message to the student that you're willing to take a minute away from your instruction to make sure that they stay safe. And it also does something else. A lot of times when students come to talk to me, they don't always tell me the truth about why they're coming to see me. They may say that they're getting in trouble or they did something wrong. But if you escort the student down to see me, you can explain what's going on. That way I can address this with the student more directly. Now, who can perform a suicide risk assessment? Well, every school has a school crisis plan. And in your school crisis plan, there's a group of people called the student care team. The student care team is responsible for responding to students who present with risk of harm to themselves or others, and they're responsible for keeping all students safe. Your student care team typically includes people like your school psychologist, your school counselor, your school social worker, and your mental health partners. Any of those people can perform a suicide risk assessment. Okay, now, when we do a suicide risk assessment, we need to make sure that parents are always notified if there is any risk of suicide or self-harm. Typically, it's the person who does the risk assessment who notifies parents. But I would encourage you to ask that person if they're going to call the parents, and if they are not going to call the parents, I encourage you to go ahead and make that call and let the parents know what's going on. When we get done with the suicide risk assessment, we're going to have an estimate if this student is low risk, moderate risk, or high risk. Now, for moderate or high-risk students, the parents are going to be asked to transport the student to a local hospital or to a mental health provider who's qualified to perform an emergency evaluation. The purpose of that emergency evaluation is to determine if this student needs immediate hospitalization or if they're safe enough to return home with their parents, and then schedule some type of therapy appointment for mental health services on an outpatient basis. Now, these moderate to high-risk students need to remain in the constant supervision of a staff member until they can be handed off to their parents. These are extremely vulnerable students. So it's from our hands to the parents' hands. We don't put these students on a bus to go home. We need to assure that we're handing them over to their parents. Now, that's how it typically goes. A teacher sees a warning sign that a student could be thinking about suicide. They escort the student down to see me. I do a risk assessment, determine that the student is moderate or high risk, call the parents. Parents come and take the child to the hospital. That's what usually happens. But you and I know that things don't always go the way we plan. There are some situations where we cannot reach a parent. Now again, we must always notify parents in these situations. But if we have called every phone number at our disposal, if we've asked the child if there's any phone numbers that we can call, if we've asked the child for any phone numbers or family or friends who might be able to reach their parent, if we've asked the kids' friends if there's other phone numbers that they're aware of, and if we've sent someone out even to the house or to the parent's place of work and we cannot locate a parent, now at this point, we're talking about either child abandonment or child neglect. Now, you and I both know that any school employee who observes child abuse or child neglect is responsible for notifying Children's Services, 241 Kids, or the local law enforcement. So in this case, if we've gone through all those steps and we cannot locate a parent, we need to call Children's Services, 241 Kids, or notify a law enforcement officer. There's also instances in which parents refuse to access mental health services for their children. Now, if a child is at high risk of suicide, that child is eligible for immediate hospitalization or arrest. High-risk children are kids who have an intention to kill themselves. They're telling you, I'm going to kill myself. They have a plan, they have access to the means to carry out that plan, and they can tell you when and where they're going to do it. So in the same way, we need to notify either Children's Services or law enforcement if these parents are now refusing those services. In the city of Cincinnati, the Cincinnati police are responsible for transporting suicidal individuals to the hospital. Now, if you live outside the city limits, those other jurisdictions have to establish their own guidelines for emergency services personnel. In Cincinnati, police officers determine if the person is in fact suicidal and they do the transportation. In other places, it could be fire department, police, or ambulance services who make that determination. So if we run into a situation like this, I encourage school personnel to contact your school resource officer. A police officer can transport a student to the hospital even if the parent refuses to give consent. But again, that would be only for high-risk students, and the police officer has to make that determination. Calling Children's Services, 241 Kids, is also a valuable resource. They can also give you recommendations about things to do in that situation. Now, if the student is not high risk, if they're moderate risk or low risk, a lot of times we're still very worried about these students, and parents may still refuse services. In those cases, we have to respect the parent's obligation to provide appropriate medical and mental health services for their family members. So what we do is we put our concerns in writing, and we also write down a list of community resources that are available to provide an evaluation and support services, and we give that to the parent. Now, we put this in writing and give this to the parent so that when the parent gets home, they may reconsider. And they may go ahead and take their child to that resource that can provide that emergency evaluation. It could also be a couple of days later that the parent begins to realize, yeah, my child really does have problems, and they have a paper that they can access and make that phone call right away and get access to that service right away. So if a student is hospitalized for being suicidal, we know that at some point they're going to be discharged, and they're going to come back to school, and they're going to come back to us. And so we want to provide appropriate follow-up, and that's the fourth step. I encourage parents to grant release of information from the hospitals to the school personnel. Now, parents have the right for the privacy of all of their medical information, and so they don't have to grant that consent. But I encourage parents to do so for a couple of reasons. And I explain to parents that we know that schools are often stressful places for students. And many of the stresses that their child experienced that led to them being suicidal, they could have experienced at school. That could include social stress, that could include academic work, and a variety of other stresses. I also share with parents that schools are a good place for teachers to keep an eye on their child, to monitor for signs that the child is getting better or getting worse. And so if we have a chance to talk to the hospital personnel, we can identify the signs that the child is getting better or signs that they may be coming into another crisis. And then we can take steps to prevent that crisis before it occurs. We may be able to identify signs that the child's having a problem before they get to be suicidal again. Every time I've shared this with parents, they've been willing to grant consent for the release of that information. And so that's what we do. We come up with a safety plan for each child who returns to school. Now, that safety plan needs to be shared with all teachers who are working with this student. We don't share it with anyone who's not working with the student. But the teachers who provide a direct service to the student, as well as administrators, need to have a copy of that plan. And that plan will include what are the stresses for this child, what are the warning signs that we need to watch out for, and what are the steps to take once we see the signs that the child is having a problem, those warning signs. So what can teachers do? Teachers can talk to students about suicide when you see the warning signs. It's important to remember that this does not put suicidal ideas into the student's head. This is a very common worry for many of us who talk about suicide with students. But it's important to remember that people don't try to hurt themselves when they're feeling good. If I ask you if you want to hit yourself, of course you don't want to hit yourself. In the same way, asking a student about suicide doesn't make them want to try it. The only students who are thinking about suicide are students who are already severely hurting on the inside, and they've already thought about it, so we're not putting the idea into their head. Talking to students about suicide may show them that someone else is interested and cares for them. It's also one of the only ways to understand a student's reality and the degree to which this student is depressed or thinking about suicide. So I want to ask you a question. How comfortable are you about identifying the signs and symptoms of depression and suicidal behavior? If you're not comfortable and you're not confident in your abilities to do this, I encourage you to go back and watch this video again for those warning signs. You can also get additional information about suicide from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And that website is www.suicidepreventionlifeline.org. They have lots of information about warning signs and suicide prevention. They also have a 24-hour suicide crisis hotline. That number is 1-800-273-TALK, 1-800-273-8255. And I often call a suicide crisis hotline if I'm working with a student and I'm not exactly sure what to do. So if I need help making the decision, I'll call that hotline just for some additional support to help me decide what's the best thing to do. I also wonder, how comfortable and confident are you about referring a student who displays the signs and symptoms of depression or suicidal behavior? If you're not comfortable making that referral to a member of your student care team, I encourage you to go ahead and talk to those team members. Ask them what they would do if you brought a student to them and you said you were worried about this student being suicidal. Let them explain to you what they do, how they handle the situation. That way you can be more comfortable once you see these warning signs. A trusting relationship with at least one responsible adult can be a moderator for the distress the students feel. The expectation that there are resources that can help is a powerful protective factor. Reasons for living, if you will. That resource that can help can be you and me. We can be that resource. We can become a lifeline for our students.
Ron, wanted to thank you for the wealth of information on depression and suicide, especially what teachers can do. I do have a few questions that educators may be interested in hearing your responses. Do I really have to worry about this if I teach younger children?
suicide is the second leading cause of death for teenagers, but it's the fourth leading cause of death for children under the age of 14. It doesn't happen as often as it does for teenagers, but it does still happen. Right now, Cincinnati is experiencing an increase in the number of students between 5th grade and 8th grade who have been making suicide attempts. This is happening in Cincinnati as well as in some of the surrounding suburbs. This is a big concern for Cincinnati Public Schools as well as these suburban districts, even Cincinnati Children's Hospital. So just because you work in an elementary school doesn't mean that you're not going to see these things and have students with suicidal behaviors. In fact, the very first student that I worked with who was suicidal was a 1st grade student who was sitting in his 1st grade classroom stuffing paper into his mouth. And he was doing this because he had seen a TV special the previous evening about an elderly man who stuffed paper into his windpipe to stop his breathing and kill himself. So this was a very big concern. Now, we were able to get help for this student, but it just kind of serves as a reminder that just because you're a teacher of kindergarten or 1st grade students doesn't mean that you're not going to see signs of depression, even suicidal behavior among some of your students.
Isn't this a bigger problem for Caucasian students than minority students?
Well, white students, Caucasian students do have higher rates of suicide than minority groups. The only minority group that has higher rates of suicide than white students is Native Americans. But the differences with the minority groups are not that significant. Black students have been catching up with white students in their rates of suicide since the 1980s. In fact, in the most recent version of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, Black students said that they thought about suicide and attempted suicide more often than white students. But whatever the race or background of a student, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference when we're talking about a student who's depressed and suicide. There is a difference that has been consistent over time, and that's the difference between boys and girls. Girls attempt suicide about twice as often as boys, and boys die from suicide about 3 times as often as girls. That's because boys tend to choose more lethal means. Boys tend to make suicide attempts with guns or by hanging, and girls tend to make suicide attempts with medications or pills. But again, the differences don't make much matter in terms of when I'm working with a child who is suicidal. The pain of depression looks remarkably similar, whether the student is Caucasian, Hispanic, Asian, African American, and the rate, the way that a student finds recovery from depression and suicidal behavior is an individual path. Each individual has to rely on their own abilities, resources, and deal with their own stresses, their own situation to determine their path to recovery. And so those are the things that we really want to focus on when working with our students.
I'm curious, what are the statistics in Cincinnati regarding suicide and attempts?
Well, I don't have actual statistics for Cincinnati, but I do know that there has been an increase in attempts in our region. Cincinnati Children's Hospital keeps a lot of this information, and one of the things they've said is that they know that there's about 200 to 300 suicide attempts for every student who dies from suicide. We also know that there's been an increase in deaths for suicide for several school districts. Many districts have had multiple deaths within the same year. And since around 2011, 2012, there just kind of seems to be an increase in many of our schools, and the other school personnel and the hospital personnel I talked to have seen this increase.
How can kids get to the point of thinking about suicide? Can't they just snap out of it? What does a kid have to be depressed about today?
Well, depression is not just about having a tough situation or living a difficult life, although kids have lots of tough situations and kids deal with a lot of really, really tough things. But depression affects the way one feels, the way one thinks, the way one acts, as well as physical well-being. It affects brain chemicals. It affects a person's ability to eat, to sleep, to concentrate, and to calm oneself down. It's a chemical imbalance. That's not something someone just snaps out of. So in terms of dealing with depression, we know that there's several things that can contribute to depression. For example, a child who's experienced a significant loss or trauma. Loss could include things like death of a loved one or a family that's been broken up by divorce. Trauma could include such things as being a victim of abuse or witnessing an act of violence or being the victim of a violent crime. It could also include having friends and relatives who die from homicide. Now, these things affect children as well as adults, and they can lead to depression. But the path of healing from that depression is individual, and we need to recognize that. So the pain is individual, and the path to recovery is also an individual path.
Ron, today we see, as far as on television commercials, medications being associated with suicide. Can medicine make students suicidal?
In 2004, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a black box warning for a lot of antidepressants. And they did that because there had been some research that showed that when children started taking these medicines, they started having additional thoughts of suicide. So you have probably seen the warning on TV commercials that says, tell your doctor if you have unusual changes in mood or behavior or thoughts of suicide. Well, the concern was that even though the medications could make someone less depressed, they might still be suicidal. But the research hasn't really borne this out. And so since 2004, researchers are recommending that the benefits of taking these medicines are stronger than the risks associated with them. Now, we know that different medicines affect people differently. So some medications have side effects, and some of the side effects could make a child more agitated or have difficulty eating or sleeping. Now, if that's what's taking place, then the medicine's probably not helping the child with their depression. The bottom line is that the research is still out, so you really need to rely on your doctor's advice. Tell your doctor anytime you are going to start or stop taking medication, tell your doctor about the side effects, and let your doctor help you make decisions about what medications to take.
And if someone really wants to kill himself, is there anything anyone can really do to stop them?
There are about 200 suicide attempts for every child or teenager who dies from suicide. So just because a kid makes a suicide attempt, it doesn't mean they're going to die from suicide. There's lots of things that we can do. For some students, this is a way of communicating how much pain they are feeling. It's a cry for help. Now, we know that there are many reasons that students try to kill themselves, and there are solutions for all of those reasons. But if a student dies, they don't get a chance to see those reasons. We can remind students that there are solutions for problems. We can also help students get a better self-identity, help them recognize that they're a child, they're growing. They're not a burden, they're a growing child. We can also help them build connections, connections to the school, connections with their peers, connections with their teachers. Those connections can help them have a sense of belongingness. It's important to remember that one resource that can help can become a reason for living, a lifeline for these students. You and I can be that resource that can help. We can become a lifeline.
Ron, thank you for being part of this exciting project and sharing your level of expertise to assist educators in dealing with a serious issue that some of our students may face today.
You're very welcome, and thank you.